Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It is Monday morning here in upper Midwest of the United States of America. Almost July, late June. Time just keeps slipping by, man. I want to thank everybody who's been following the channel and watching, and Patreon supporters especially. Thank you guys. Very valuable to me. It's very appreciated. There's been a bit of a buzz in some of my recent episodes, and that's because this room isn't air conditioned. It gets 90 degrees in here sometimes, so I've had fans going, and it's hard to not have them playing. I'm still hot with them on. I did turn one of the loudest ones off for this episode. Hopefully it makes a difference. It's not too unpleasant this morning, so we're getting through that okay. For everyone who watched my episode on the great reorganization of my records, the jazz records, back to by label, over 75 labels have been now separated out and sorting that history. One of the questions I got the most and comments I got the most is, how do you find anything? And it's something I kind of take for granted at this point, because I've kind of learned a lot of the sequence and know the chronology, and one of the benefits of doing it this way is you really learn the tracking of what these labels accomplish and what they do and when things come from. There's certain records that I know instantly that's got to be from 58, 59. I know about when that is in that label's history. For example, Curtis Fuller on Savoy. I know exactly where they're not in the early black and white covers. They're not with like the Parkers and the Coma Hawkins and those records, Lester Young's. They're more towards the end of the Savoy run. So you just kind of start instinctively being able to know what part, what chapter of a label certain records are going to be part of. But there's certainly so much to be gained by having your records set up by label if you have enough records to do so. It's incredibly insightful, but in order to sort them that way, you have to spend time with them and playing with them, and all that kind of time you spend messing with them and writing them down and putting them into lists. It's all part of the process of learning. And one of the things that I really was kind of shocked by in this recent episode, it's the first time I think I've ever shown what I think is a pretty incredible collection, whether it's by one artist or one label or the entire collection, without there being one or two or three guys being like, I can't believe you don't have this. And it's kind of human nature. It happens across the board, not just jazz collectors. But this is the first time I've ever not gotten that. So I must have gotten to a certain level where even those guys are like, oh, that's pretty impressive. Which it's partly why, being the obsessive compulsive person I am, I kind of dread in a certain way doing these comprehensive pieces where I talk about having bodies of work or entire discographies or label, there's always someone that's like, oh, but you don't have this. And it could be something that's so random. It could be a much later posthumous addition to that catalog. There's alternate covers. There's always someone who just wants to. They don't even say, "Oh, that's a great collection," but why don't you have that? It's just like, I can't believe you don't have that. Like, it just credits almost the entire other 22,500 whatever that I just showed you. All you can think of is, how come he doesn't have that one? It's always it just bothers me, being the OCD guy that I am. But I didn't get that once this time, and I was pretty happy about that. I was pretty happy about not getting one comment that was an underhanded kind of, oh, you think that's so great, but you don't even have that. So that was, again, I still am pretty happy about that. It's because it never fails. Going back years, it never fails. So, but what you learn having your record set up by label, and again, it takes a lot of the body of work to make it have any sense or value or meaning. But it starts with Blue Note for me. The Blue Note was the first label I really set out to collect the label discography. And in so doing, you really start to learn exactly when certain artists show up. You know Sonny Clark's window is here. So you know generally where you got to go to find certain Sonny Clark record. But you also know Leapin' and Lopin' came out a couple years later when he came back, so you know that's going to be more here. And all that filing and all that pulling and looking for things, you really start to see the juxtaposition of what came out around that record. And so it's giving you this context that's constantly layering and layering and layering new chapters to that label's story. And it's kind of shocking, honestly, how not difficult it is for me to find most things when I start to look for them. And again, there's only about 15, 20 labels that have this incredible body of work that's so massive that it's going to take you time to learn it. Collecting some of the smaller labels, you know, even like a VJ, there's only 30, 40 titles, so what's early, what's late, you know, it doesn't take a whole lot of, you know, flipping through to find what you're looking for. So it's the bigger labels like Verve and Prestige, but both Verve and Prestige, the difference between 70-23 and 75-65 is pretty massive. You know, just in terms of the artists, in terms of the sound, in terms of what was cool in jazz, it's a pretty big gulp. In Verve, if I'm looking for something that's 83-16 versus something that's 86-52, in my mind, I know exactly that this is that era of Verve, and so it narrows it down, and it's a part of the education, and it's learning that sequence by looking and flipping through it and going, oh, man, all this stuff came out in that same era. What a great little period they had. I think Blue Train was one of the first examples, learning, I think it's 1577 if I remember, but learning to find Blue Train is how I learned how many great records Blue Note put out right around Blue Train. It's an incredible run that Blue Note does, and I've done an episode on it, 1958, 57. There's such a string, whether you want to talk about the 3 or 4 records on each side of Blue Train, or even a bigger scope, if you look at the 20 records before it and the 20 that come after it, it's hard bop to find. Like, that's hard bop's moment in the sun. It's an incredible documentation, and it's just really part of my insight, part of my vocabulary, part of the knowledge base I speak from. And a lot of times why I show these collection videos, it's in some way to validate who I am and what I have to say. It's not just, oh, look at my record collection. It's like, I'm not just speaking about these labels and this history and my perspective on it out of a vacuum. Like, people who say, oh, that's the best Riverside ever, and they have 8 Riversides. I mean, I'm not going to dismiss you. I'm glad you like said record. But if you've only got 8 of them, it's not really a platform from which you should be announcing your grand pontifications. You know, it's having that body of work that can allow you to define a label's moment, its sound, its rise and its decline. You got to really have all those pieces to see even how prominent a label it was. The Blue Note canon, piece after piece after piece, they've all been reissued umpteen times and are all part of the jazz vocabulary. If you're now a second or third tier jazz fan, and a first tier means I got Miles Davis and I stream my jazz sometimes. You know, a second tier means you dug a little deeper and you got some Coltrane, you bought a Monk record, and you know a few things more, and you're starting to discover Blue Note. But if you're like a senior level 2 or a level 3, level 4 collector, Blue Note, most of those names are going to be familiar to those guys. There's not a lot of obscure names in the Blue Note canon, in part because the Blue Note legacy at this point has elevated the more obscure artists and titles to a point of they're far more recognized in the jazz community now than they were at the time. which is really interesting because I think there's a skew to our perspectives today and how we see a lot of artists. And a lot of artists that were on labels that don't have that same magnification, those artists have tended to slip more into obscurity than a label like Blue Note, which elevates the entire canon because of its legacy, because of its broad demand. It means anything people find on Blue Note, they're like, oh, this must be great. And for the most part, anything pre-sale is going to be great. You know, the 10-inch era has a bit more diversity to its sound. It's not a unified Blue Note sound in the 10-inch era, really. And post-sale, there's a more of an inconsistency in the Blue Note sound. A lot changes after the sale in '67. But Blue Note, for the most part, has a pretty succinct thing. And knowing your label discographies, it's not just as simple as looking at your records and putting them in file. And part of the process for me started when I was shopping in the wild a lot, out in record stores. I'd go to Chicago, I'd go to the East Coast, just looking for jazz records, R&B soul records. And when you're flipping through recent arrivals, before the internet came along, when you found something in the wild that you didn't have, you knew it instantly because you'd never seen it before for the most part, you know, or you knew you'd seen it once or twice but it was too much or it was beat up. But the internet's muddied the waters. And I'm saying it in regards to the fact you could have bid on a record 2 or 3 times on the internet and not won it, which doesn't happen in the wild. You see something you want bad enough, you're going to buy it. On the internet, you can lose an auction 2 or 3 times for a record and then find yourself in a store flipping through going, did I get this or not? And this is far beyond the point of having 40, 50, 60 jazz records. This is once you're into the point of having 600, 700, 2,000, 4,000. When you have a big body of jazz, it does get muddied. The covers do tend to have enough similarities. Enough records have been reissued multiple times with different covers. I found myself so many times being in a record store going, do I have this? Is this the alternate cover? Or is this the same record? Like, there's a couple of early modern jazz quartet records on Prestige that have 2 covers. And you'd always be like, I don't have this. Or do I? You know, it was confusing. I remember having to call home, asking my wife or my stepkids, like, hey, can you look at my records to see if I have this title, that number? Like, and it would be kind of burdensome for them because they don't know the artist, the covers, the numbers. It was hard for them to read. So they had to go to a record shelf, try to find this artist or the label and tell me over the phone if I had something. And it became kind of frustrating, to be honest, because it happened quite often. And I figured there had to be a better way for me to know what I had. And coming home with the same record is not fun. But what's worse is coming home thinking you had a record and getting home and going, oh, fuck, I don't have that. Damn it. I've always wanted that. And you can really regret not buying a record you wanted when you saw it. In part because you weren't clear if you had it or not, because you bid on enough times at auction or followed or watched it enough at auction to, again, you buy enough records online, you really kind of lose track of some things, especially when the volume gets big enough in your collection. So what I did to counter that was I took all my favorite jazz artists and I did a printout of their discography. And I'm going to pause this and I'm going to grab you my printouts to show you. So my printouts were initially in a little plastic bag where I had 2 dozen to start. You know, Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, just the artists I really was trying to collect their body of work by. It was a lot of kind of that generation of player, the Duke Pearsons, a lot of the Blue Note cats, honestly. Once I collected the Blue Note label, I wanted to get their other records on other labels. I wanted to not buy a budget copy of something. If this is not the artist, this was not the Savoy session, this was something reissued. by some budget label years later that was that Savoy Session. I didn't want those. I want the right records. And so these printouts became very valuable to me. And I would slowly add more and more printouts to my collection. And once I got 4, 5, 6 records by an artist, I would add a printout. And initially, I probably started with about 40 printouts. Jackie McLean, Herbie Hancock, Monk, Coltrane and Miles, of course. So they both had big printouts, which those ones are pages long. I started adding players that were great sidemen. Didn't have a lot of records as a leader, but they were such prolific sidemen that I wanted to see the records that a guy like Paul Chambers was on, Wynton Kelly was on, Jerome Richardson. Those guys had pages of side work, just prolific sidemen. And then a guy like Kenny Burrell, you find out, is a prolific recorder as a leader. He's also prolific as a sideman. Wynton Kelly didn't lead a lot of records, but he's on a ton of stuff as a side guy. And some guys spend very little time doing side work. Monk doesn't do a lot of side work. He pretty much dove right into being Monk. But most guys come up doing side work, start becoming leaders, and then when they become leaders, stop doing side work. Other guys like Art Blakey never seem to stop doing side work. He loved to play. He loved to support his men. He loved to help them grow and start their own groups. And so this became that. A little booklet that had 20, 30, 40 pieces of paper in it is now this binder that has hundreds of artists in it. And literally, it's an incredible learning tool. You see there's Stan Getz. And what's highlighted is, of course, stuff I have. The binder's actually starting to fall apart a little bit, so I need to be careful when I flip pages here. But this book became such a valuable tool. There's Benny Golson. I'm going to pull this down for a second here. Just going to flip through some stuff. This is Grant Green's leadership, his side work. I initially was doing color codes for labels, but eventually I got to a point where there was just too many labels to be able to do that. So there's like Johnny Griffin's work. I see how I have all his leaders, all his stuff in Argo, Blue Note, then the green was the Riverside, red was the Prestige, and there's some rare random titles from Atlantic, Mercury. There's Griffin's side work. There's Gigi Grice, again side work. Vince Guaraldi, Jim Hall, Johnny Hartman, Hampton Hawes, and it's just Coleman Hawkins. What an incredible body of work. Ellington, Basie, Oscar Peterson. So many of these artists have such incredible bodies of work. There's Shelly Mann. There's Herbie Mann. Shelly Mann's side work. Charlie Mariano, Les McCann, Hal McCusick, Jack McDuff, Eddie McFadden, Gary McFarland, Howard McGee, Jackie McLean, Jackie Sidework, Marion McPartland, Gil Mell, Helen Merrill, Charlie Mingus, Billy Mitchell, Blue Mitchell, Blue Mitchell Sidework, Red Mitchell, more Red Mitchell, Hank Mobley, Mobley Sidework, Modern Jazz Quartet. It just kind of goes on and on. There's Monk, there's Wes Montgomery, Jack Montrose, James Moody, Lee Morgan. So it just led to a real learning process. And you no longer had to look and call home and say, do I have this record? You now simply had to say, book, do I have this record by this artist? And as my knowledge has grown, as my collection's grown, the printouts have grown. And then the next part of that was I did one for the labels. And here we are right here. This is Jubilee, I believe. And if you look online, you'll find the printouts for most labels. This is Jazz West right here. And some of these labels are small with a few pages. Other labels like Impulse are pages long. And it's in filling in these gaps in this book where you learn the label sequence. There's Emercy. I have the first 100 and up to 36-122, so I have the first 122 Emercy titles. I'm missing a few here. A Billy Eckstein, a Pete Rugolo, a big Bill Broomsey record, which I don't think was even issued. You learn the stuff that wasn't issued, and then a lot of these titles here actually had Mercury releases as well, and Emercy gets phased out. Here's my Epic records, which I had a hard time actually finding an actual sequence for Epic. More Epic, Everest. Here's Fantasy out of San Francisco. You can just see there's mostly highlighted. And I've always tried to fill in the early era of labels, because the early era is kind of where they start, and it gives you an idea of the direction they're going to go. Fantasy debut, more debut stuff, little Felstead label, G&P. And it's in filling in this stuff, we really learn the chronology better than you think you would. Hi-Fi Jazz out of the West Coast. Here's Prestige. Now, Prestige is this entire section. It's like 800 Prestige records, and I have 577. And between Moodsville, Jazzville, Swingville, and then all the 7000 sequence, Prestige just goes on and on and on. And I have the first, like I said, 10 years almost completed. There's a few exceptions. Some of these yellow ones are actually reissues of the same title, so you can even you can even learn that. You can be in the record store and find a record like, oh, I don't have the Sonny Rollins, and then you look it up, you're like, oh, this is a reissue of 7026. So do I really need that Sonny Rollins? And then it comes down to the cost and how cool is the cover, those type of variants. Riverside, again, pretty much a complete body of work here. And filling in a lot of these labels, it's a complete education. There's all the Jazzland stuff at the end there. And then even confusing it more is when you start adding in the 10-inch stuff. And was this 10-inch stuff re-released on 12-inch stuff, or was this all original material? It's sometimes I'll include little bios with the label just so I keep remembering who the significant names were. This is the Roost 10-inch sequence, which you can see now I have almost the entire thing. And then this is the Roost 12-inch sequence, which I do have pretty much the entire thing there. Then we got Roulette. And this is Savoy. That's the Savoy 10-inch I got. And here's like all the complete body of work Savoy. The first one I'm missing is Stablemates. There's a few that weren't issued. So you learn a lot. Here's Regent, the Savoy sister label. And then this is Storyville, the 10 inches at Storyville. And I am by no means saying you should go out and print off every label and every artist. You start off with the artists you're really collecting it into, maybe a few labels that you really want to know more about, print those off, and they slowly go from being in a bag to being in a small binder to being in a big binder to now the point where I have two big thick binders, one of labels, one of artists. So those books are a big part of how I can find things. And if there's a title that I can't look at right away and be like, okay, where's that? I'll just go to the book and go to the label and be like, okay, there it is. That's that Johnny Smith record I wanted to find on Roost. And again, Roost is 60 records, so I don't mind flipping through Roost, looking for a Johnny Smith record, and then flipping through, I'm learning that sequence, learning those eras, what came before what. And oftentimes even what you'll find is what the cover looks like will also tell you something about when it's from. A Savoy from 56 looks a lot different than a Savoy from 1961. A Roost record from 1953 looks a lot different than a Roost record from near the end in 58. So even graphic design, print colors, text, a lot of that stuff will give you some insight into what era are you looking for this record. Where's it going to be? This can't be that early because of how it looks. The color and all that, it dictates it must be later. And ultimately, if you are too lazy to look it up, or you don't have the printouts, the other easiest thing to do is simply go, okay, I'm looking for Grant Green, Green Street, type it into Google, it'll pop up and it'll say Blue Note 4076 or whatever that happens to be, and you'll be able to go to your Canon and flip through your 4,000 titles and find it. So actually finding stuff isn't that hard. And every time you start to look out to find something, you will learn, and all that cross-sectioning and cross-referencing and sorting and writing and highlighting, it's all a big part of why I kind of know what I know. You know, it's not just, it doesn't just simply stop at buying the record and putting it on the shelf. It's about juggling it around enough to where I have a clarity in my mind of where this fits in the overall puzzle of jazz. And that's something that, again, the records themselves, the collection itself, has been an incredible educational tool. And it's often why I want to make episodes and share with people. Like, oh, I learned this from my collection. It'll take you a long time to collect what I've collected, and you can't really learn it through the CD issues or even imported copies, or certainly not through streaming or online. You have to have the tactile records in your hand and know the sequence and when the label changed from the 1200 Pacific title to the 400 Pacific title, and they started the PJ1. Once you know all that stuff, you can be in the record store, find Pacific Jazz number 13, and be like, oh, that's got to be what, 58, 59, 60, and you just start narrowing down all of that information to the point where the clarity becomes greater and greater and greater. So, how do I find stuff? The printouts. If you have to go online, it'll tell you right away where what the number is. And people say, well, I often want to hear a certain record. I don't really look by label. I look by artist. That's not really the case for me that much anymore. And most of my favorite records by favorite artists, I have a fairly good grasp right away where that record is. I could go find you Johnny Hartman and John Coltrane pretty quick. You know, I could go find you Sonny Clark, Sonny's Crib pretty quick. I know 1576, I think it is. You know, it's like you learn that stuff. And those numbers do have a significant value. And like I've said in other episodes, each label you'll learn has a trajectory and a story and a prominence and an innovation of its own. Each label brought something to the table. And no two labels have the same profile. Every label has its own independent trajectory, moment of truth, innovative revelations, moments where they were kind of leading the pack, and other times when they were kind of just being copycats. And even learning the moment labels kind of show up on the scene and where labels disappeared. You know, it's sad, the death of a lot of these labels. Riverside, tragic. Bethlehem selling the King, sad. It's too bad we didn't get more of that great mid-50s Bethlehem sound that we did. What a great sound they had for 3, 4, 5 years. I'll take that mid-50s Bethlehem, Stu Williamson, Charlie Mariano era, Frank Rosolino stuff over a lot of labels. It's fantastic material. And so you do learn so much. And that's the most important reason to do it, but it does take a big body of work in order for it to have any value. Two things I want to share real quick. I did a Records I Most Wanted episode probably last month. I finally got these 2 Dave Bailey records. I probably paid a little bit too much for both of them, but I did do a graduation party for a friend of mine, and I treated myself by buying these two, as well as buying the house, a dehumidifier, and a carpet cleaner, and a few things. I bought these 2 records for myself, and they're outstanding. This was reissued as a Grant Green record in the 60s, but this is the original incarnation of it, and the lineup's outstanding, as is this one. Both on the Jazz Time, Jazz Line, small little label that disappeared very quickly. And the other interesting thing I learned about these two was Frank Haynes, who plays the tenor on these records, is a really wonderful tenor player that I'll be honest, I wasn't even too familiar with. I think I'd seen the name a few times. He shows up on a few other sessions, but very infrequently. And boy, does he have a wonderful tone and a kind of a clarity and a softness, but a very vital, very energetic softness. It's a wonderful player. So again, you're always learning, and Frank Haynes is one more piece of the puzzle. And jazz is such an incredible web. Unlike any other genre, jazz spider webs its way away from wherever you dive in, and the cosmic fabric, the cosmic web, just spindles in every direction. And you're always learning, you're always grasping new moments in jazz and new artists and new ways of emoting. And the variance as you get deeper into jazz, the variance from one trumpet player to the next becomes very prominent. The variance in different sax players becomes very pronounced. It's not some subliminal thing. It doesn't take years of listening to hear the difference between a guy like Art Farmer and a guy like Clifford Brown. And so a lot of it's more simple than people want to think it is. The last record I want to talk about, I'll talk about current artists, and by current I mean last 20, 30 years, hardly at all. And a record I've enjoyed a lot over the years and played a lot of my gigs is this Cassandra WIlson record. It's a nice Verve Forecast. It's a gatefold. It's really lovely packaging. Some nice photographs of Cassandra. She has that gravelly, husky voice, but it's filled with a genuine sincerity. It doesn't feel forced or stylized or like it's being presented to sound hip. I'm not trying to sound like Louis Armstrong. It's a real genuine husk in her tone that's really brings a feeling to what she sings. And she's singing mostly Billie Holiday songs on this record. It's called Coming Forth by Day. And of course, Billie was Lady Day. Fantastic versions of these songs. They're stripped down, they're live, they're presented by a fairly minimal approach in the arrangements. And if I had to compare it to something, I'd compare it to seeing Tom Waits live in the 90s on like the Mule Variation tour, where he was playing with upright bass and jazz and a pianist and some percussion, and there was lots of space, and a lot of the instruments were making sounds that weren't easily identifiable as being, oh, that's the guitar or that's that percussion. And it was a lot of interesting tonality that Waits was presenting, and live it was just a thrill to see him. And this record reminds me of that, where there's some interesting sound that you have to think, what's making that sound? But there's room for that sound to breathe. It's not lost in a dense production or a dense arrangement. Each piece has little spaces for it to carve out and make its little pronounced impact. And so even though it's a soft, minimalist arrangement, because of how well it's spaced, each tone and sound gets this room to breathe. And I've played this record on a lot of my gigs, my brunch gigs, anniversary parties, wedding parties. Something you can put on, just needle drop it, and let a few songs play if you gotta go to the bathroom or something. It's got a wonderful soft pulse to it. A nice soft pulse. And I don't have a lot of her work. I have a few CDs, and I might have one other record, I can't remember. But I really enjoyed this Cassandra WIlson record. Highly recommend it. Some cool, aching guitar right there. It sounded like a train whistle or something. It's fantastic. Again, very Tom Waits-like to me in terms of how it's arranged. And it'll also, like the Tom Waits records, it allows for the voice to have its space, because she's not belting. She's softly enunciating the vocal. And Tom Waits is also very subtle in how he releases his words. His verbiage is very important. So what I say can't get lost by a trumpet. So I need to say my incredibly clever lyric, in the land of the blind, the man with one eye is king. And now, as I pause, that trumpet can say, ooh, like it's got to be carefully packaged. And that's what great production and arrangement's about. And Waits doesn't let his lyrics get buried, and Cassandra here also has room for her voice to say what it needs to say. And then the instrumentalists bring their sound in their allotted spaces and times. So it's a great record. Really enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed this episode. if you're getting to the point where your collection's getting big enough where you don't always know what you have live when you're in a record store, do some printouts. Especially the artists you're really collecting, the ones you really want to know. If there's a label you're trying to collect, it can be very confusing being in the wild without these tools. And I find even online, if I don't have my books even now, and I go into a store, usually my phone just doesn't have the same immediate tangibility. My phone doesn't want to load in a lot of record stores for some reason. And just having what the internet says often isn't enough even for me to be like, yeah, I don't remember if I have this or not. And like I said, bidding on something a few times has always muddied the waters for me as to whether, did I win that? And some records, you know right away, like, oh, I've been looking for this forever. I know I haven't got this yet. But there's been many, many times where having these printouts, and they were initially made just for me to take record shopping. And they grew into something far bigger than that. They grew into actual resources for me, where I'm constantly looking at them and cross-referencing. And like, oh, he played on this record? Oh, and then I'm looking. It's an endless string of connections that these two binders offer me to help me piece together that history and to have my collection make the sense that it makes, so that I can iterate what I have to say to you guys with the greatest clarity as I can. Those printouts have been a huge part of that. So again, I recommend you do those printouts if your collection's to the point, and it doesn't take a lot. No one says you have to sit down one day and print out 300 sheets. You know, you want to do a couple dozen here, a dozen there, and just add 5, 6, 8 every few weeks. And watch your knowledge grow. Watch your conceptual grasp of artists' careers, labels' careers. It will really come into focus. And will be a valuable tool when you're shopping. You'll know instantly, like, oh, yeah, that's the one I'm missing. I haven't got that one yet. And that there's also, for me being OCD, there's a great satisfaction to highlighting that one that I've been looking for that fills in a sequence. Like, man, that's the one record by Blue Mitchell I couldn't find on Riverside, and there it is. I got it now. And that's part of my obsessive compulsive, is once I do start highlighting or collecting something, now it's like, okay, now I want all those records, you know. And I try to create parameters for myself. Like, I'm only going to collect up to this point, or I'm just going to collect the first decade or the early part. And those things always grow as your budget changes and as what you fill in changes. You start to expand that. And I'm to the point now where 1950 to 1965, I have a fairly good chunk of that history. And I got quite a bit of stuff, 65 to 75, but much less. And then post 75, it's, you know, maybe a section of records like that from the 80s and 90s and jazz. And then there's thousands of other records in my collection as well, which I haven't needed to do that for, because rock is so different. A rock band's discography is much more clear. Jazz artists, like I said, a guy like Paul Chambers, he's on hundreds of records. And if you discover you love Paul Chambers, or even knowing a guy like Oscar Pettiford, the great bass player, you'll soon see by studying these books that he doesn't have any material post this point because he passed away. So you're even learning that. There's a lot of things. Y'all be safe. Have a good day. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you want to support the channel, there's a Patreon link in the description below. There's also some cool Jazz Shepherd merchandise in the merch store. If you want to support the channel that way, that's always appreciated. You all stay safe out there. We're working on building this little cafe, coffee shop. It's slow going at this point because we're still dealing with health inspectors and the demands and making business plans. But there is a certain movement happening, which I'm excited about. And so my hope is that you guys can come visit me in the record room, the lounge, hang out, have a cup of coffee, maybe stay in the Airbnb bedroom downstairs. As things go forward, I'll keep you posted. Peace.